let the others just come in and hear what at the point where they come in. Okay, the first topic is on pulmonary embolism. So I'd like to share my slider. Can you see my slide?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay, so the first of the three topics is pulmonary embolism. As I understand it, uh, you have the old transcriptions with you anyway. There are just some new things that are happening with regard to pulmonary embolism, which also would like to share with you. Okay. The learning objectives are the same as for the previous years. And of course, that these learning objectives are the things that you must know and understand because this forms part of the examination. Okay. So, pulmonary embolism remains a common preventable cause of death among hospitalized patients. It is a complication of venous thrombosis, and together with venous thrombosis, it comprises what we call as the disease complex we call as venous thromboembolism. Okay, and in hospitalized patients, and recently with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was found that VTE was extensively seen. No, in fact, 1/4 of autopsied patients have PE during that period. Okay, usually the thrombi originate from the deep venous system of the lower extremities, and then gets detached uh, is transported into the lungs. Okay, but the emboli or the blood clot may also come from other parts of the body. And when they do lodge in the lungs, they are typically multiple, with the lower lobes being involved most often. Okay. There are other forms of non-thrombotic embolism, but we will just talk mainly about the thrombotic embolism for the purpose of this lecture. But you should also familiarize yourself with the other non-thrombotic embolism. And I think I broached these particular conditions in my previous lecture from last year. Okay. Virchow triad, which forms the cornerstone for the pathogenesis for pulmonary embolism for a long, long time, remains an important concept in the pathogenesis of VTE. But in addition to that, it is now recognized that inflammation plays an important role, no? And it underpins the pathogenesis of pulmonary embolism and some other thrombotic events, no, such as myocardial infarction and stroke. In fact, the relationship is such that patients with PE are twice as likely to later on develop MI or stroke, and vice versa also. Patients with MI or stroke are twice as likely compared to others to develop pulmonary embolism. And as I said, inflammation is important, and as this slide shows, certain disease entities that are associated with inflammation likewise may serve as trigger for an underlying condition for the development of pulmonary embolism. Okay. In the presence of risk factors, okay, this will lead to the development of venous thrombosis, no? Primarily, as I mentioned, in the legs, but may also be seen in other parts of the body. Okay, and these blood clots may remain there, okay? But in doing so, that if it has remained there for a long period of time and the body has not been able to lyse it early enough on its own, then it can lead to what we call as a post-thrombotic syndrome, which is a condition whereby the legs are seen to be swollen, okay, and there is also leg pains, okay, and sometimes in severe conditions, this may even be associated with leg ulcers, okay. On the other hand, what happens many times is that the thrombus in the legs will detach, okay, and then travel through the inferior vena cava, right side of the heart, and then into the pulmonary arterial system where they will lodge and produce the what we call as the pulmonary embolism. So after pulmonary embolism, the body, of course, will try also to lyse this blood clot so that it may resolve spontaneously or it may resolve as a result of treatment. But after resolution of pulmonary embolism, in some patients, they encounter what is called as the post-pulmonary embolism syndrome, whereby there remains residual dyspnea, easy fatigability, exercise incapacity, and even RV dysfunction. Okay. On the other hand, also in a small subset of patients, this may produce what we call as the chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. Okay. So, and this also is associated with not just dyspnea and chest pain, but also is associated with elevations in the pulmonary vascular resistance, elevations in the pulmonary arterial pressure. Okay. And this is a chronic condition which we will discuss later on also when I talk about pulmonary hypertension. Okay. The thrombus, going back, the thrombus that has detached itself from the legs may pass through a patent foramen ovale or ASD. And this time, instead of lodging in the pulmonary circulation, it goes all the way into the brain and produces what we call as paradoxical embolism, manifesting as stroke or ischemic stroke or embolic stroke. Okay. Going on, what are the important pathophysiologic responses to pulmonary embolism? Of course, there'll be abnormal gas exchange. Principally, you expect the dead space to increase because of the obstruction of the vascular bed. Okay. You expect vacuum mismatch leading to hypoxemia and increase in the alveolar to arterial oxygen gradient. There will be stimulation of the irritant receptors, and this will send signals to the brain and induce hyperventilation. So increased minute ventilation, which overwhelms even the increase in dead space, producing a net decrease in the carbon dioxide in the blood. Okay. So those are, I think, the more important ones. Of course, there are others: increase airway resistance, decrease lung compliance. Okay, but one of the dreadful complications would be the cardiovascular compromise. If the thrombus is large enough, then it can cause or it can obstruct a significant portion of the pulmonary vascular bed, producing an increase in the pulmonary vascular resistance. Okay, which will reduce the outflow from the right ventricle and such decrease the left ventricular preload and subsequently decrease the cardiac output and the blood pressure. Okay. And patients who have pre-existing cardiopulmonary disease are at greater risk of having hemodynamic compromise. Okay. So this is how hypotension may develop as a result of massive pulmonary embolism. As the PVR rises, okay, the RV wall tension increases, producing dilatation of the right ventricle, okay? And when the right ventricle dilates, it pushes the interventricular septum, which separates it from the left ventricle, towards the left ventricular cavity. Therefore, reducing the left ventricular cavity, reducing the amount of the blood that the left ventricle may accommodate, and this of course
Recording in progress.
may lead to RV wall ischemia and may compromise the coronary perfusion. So this further increases the dysfunction of the right ventricle, and this also again compromises the filling of the left ventricle. Okay. Most patients with pulmonary embolism have no obvious symptoms at presentation. On the other hand, there are those that present with progressive dyspnea and even those who present with sudden hemodynamic collapse, no? And mind you, this is really going to be sudden. In fact, most of the deaths here happen during the first hour of pulmonary embolism, if they too happen. Okay. In the PIOPED 1995 study, dyspnea is present in majority of patients and is the most common presenting manifestation. Okay. And next would be the chest pain. Pulmonary infarction, which happens in 10% of cases, is associated with pleuritic pain and hemoptysis. But the good thing about pulmonary infarction is that this signals that the embolus is actually small, no? So reaching into the peripheral of the lungs where there is less collaterals, and that is where pulmonary infarction will develop. Okay. Well, the important thing to realize is that the signs and symptoms of pulmonary embolism are really non-specific. So a high index of suspicion is required. Okay. So given the proper scenario, in a patient who develops dyspnea, which is unexplained by alternative diagnosis, then that should make the clinician suspect that he is dealing with pulmonary embolism. And then he can look at the physical signs, including also examining the legs. Okay. These are the signs and symptoms of deep venous thrombosis involving the legs. And it says here that the most common symptom is a cramp in the lower calf, no? The so-called Charlie horse, okay? There will also be mild palpation discomfort of the lower calf, okay? And in those where the obstruction is massive or extensive, there will be a marked swelling of the leg, no, and the thigh, okay, together with tenderness and erythema, okay? So for the upper extremities, this is what you expect to see in this slide, okay? So because the symptoms of PE, pulmonary embolism, and DVT are non-specific, we have to come up with, the clinicians decided to come up with a scoring system to assess the pretest probability of DVT as well as pulmonary embolism. And these are the clinical variables that are part of the scoring system. So as shown at the bottom, if the score is 0 or even less than 0, okay, then the clinical likelihood of DVT is small. Whereas if it is 1 to 2, it is moderate. And if it is 3 or more, then there is a high clinical likelihood of DVT. No? So that's as far as the leg thrombus is concerned. Okay. I'll tell you later on, and I'll show you later on how we make use of this scoring criteria in making diagnostic decisions, no, for our patient. For pulmonary embolism, on the other hand, the clinical variables are shown here with their corresponding scores. Okay. And we say that there is a high clinical likelihood of pulmonary embolism if the score is greater than 4. Okay. On the other hand, if it is 4 or less, then we say that the clinical likelihood is not high. Okay. So when confronted with a suspected PTE, these are some of the lab examinations that we can order. Okay, we can classify these lab examinations as to being non-confirmatory for VTE, as well as the confirmatory tests, no, which are really imaging tests. Okay. So for the plasma D-dimer, this plasma D-dimer is really what's this? Uh, a biomarker for endogenous thrombolysis. Okay? So if the plasma D-dimer is high, then we say that there is an attempt of the body to lyse blood clot present, okay, in the vascular system. Okay? It is sensitive for DVT and for PE. More sensitive for PE than DVT because the blood clot in pulmonary embolism is generally larger than for just the DVT. Okay? The plasma D-dimer serves as a useful rule-out test so that if your D-dimer is normal or negative, then it practically rules out the presence of venous thrombosis or VTE. Okay, but it is not specific. No? So the cutoff value for patients 50 and below is about 500, and there is a correction factor for patients who are 50 and above, no? Where you multiply the age of the patient by 10, and that is now the cutoff for the plasma D-dimer level, no? To differentiate between negative and positive D-dimer tests. Okay? The chest X-ray is often normal in patients with PTE, or you'll just find non-specific findings. The purpose, though, also of the X-ray is to rule out other conditions, okay, which have the same signs and symptoms as pulmonary embolism, so that the X-ray may also provide you with alternative diagnosis to explain the signs and symptoms of the patient. Okay. On the other hand, there are certain classical findings in chest geography signifying presence of pulmonary embolism, including focal oligemia, okay, the presence of peripheral wedge-shaped densities, and an enlarged right descending pulmonary artery. The other tests that we can make use are the cardiac biomarkers. And these are used more for prognostication rather than for ruling in or ruling out pulmonary embolism. And in the presence of increased biomarkers, then this indicates the presence of RV infarction, for instance, for high serum troponin, and myocardial stretch for BNP and pro-BNP. No? So these are poor prognostic factors for pulmonary embolism if elevated. Okay. The ECG is also going to show non-specific findings, mostly just showing sinus tachycardia. The classical finding for pulmonary embolism, the so-called S in Q1, Q in lead 3, and T in inverted T in T3, is a relatively specific but insensitive finding in pulmonary embolism, meaning to say that it is seen in only a minority of cases of pulmonary embolism. On the other hand, the presence of T-wave inversion in the anterior leads B1 to B4 indicates the presence of RV strain and ischemia, also a poor prognostic sign. Okay. The echocardiogram is also used mainly for prognostication, but sometimes or rarely it may visualize a large embolus present in the proximal pulmonary arteries. Okay. it may just provide really indirect sign of PE, no? The so-called McConnell sign, where there is hypokinesia of the right ventricular free wall, no? With normal or hyperkinetic motion of the right ventricular apex. The principal diagnostic test for suspected VT is the venous ultrasound, and it relies on the loss of vein compressibility, okay, whereby the operator compresses or lightly compresses on the vein and see whether it winks or not. No, if it does wink, then it's normal. If not, then it may signify the presence of a blood clot. Okay. A confirmed DVT is an adequate surrogate for PE, meaning to say that even sometimes in situations where you cannot do a pulmonary angiogram or a CTPA to diagnose the PE, then you may just resort to venous ultrasound to show the presence of DVT and institute anticoagulation if confirmed to be present. Okay. So now the principal imaging test currently, and I think will remain so for many years, will be the CT pulmonary angiography. Okay. So here you do CT scan and also you do you inject dye, okay, and watch it go through the pulmonary vasculature, okay. The thing about CTPE is that it can image the small peripheral emboli, no? Sometimes even more so than the invasive pulmonary angiography. And it also additionally provides excellent images of the right ventricle and left ventricle, which may be helpful for risk stratification. Okay. Also, because you are visualizing the heart and the lungs, it may provide alternative diagnosis not seen on X-ray to account for the presenting signs and symptoms of the patient. In many years past, okay, the radionuclide lung scanning was among the principal diagnostic tools. But really, the drawback with this radionuclide lung scanning, the so-called VQ scan, is that most of the time it just provides you with intermediate results, no, or indeterminate results. Meaning to say that it often does not really confirm or is not able to confirm the presence of pulmonary embolism, because there should be a mismatch in there being a perfusion defect in a portion of the lungs, okay, a segmental perfusion defect with no corresponding ventilation defect for it to confirm the presence of pulmonary embolism. Okay. So other alternative tests would be the invasive pulmonary angiography, which used to be the gold standard for pulmonary embolism. But as I have mentioned a while back, for small emboli, sometimes the CTPA is even more sensitive than the invasive pulmonary angiography. So that's why it has been replaced by the CTPA. Okay. So please also, I might not mention everything that is written in the slide, but please also look at them. I think you will have copies of the slide, and you do have copies from previous years. So you can just refer to them because they are also important. No? And I keep saying this also to my students for purposes of the examination, which I think is also your chief concern. Okay. What the questions that I will ask are those that are present in the slide, whether I've mentioned them or not. Okay. Also, I may ask questions which are not present in the slide, but which I have mentioned in my lecture. What I will not ask are questions which I have not mentioned and is not present in the slide. So ang tamang question for me to ask of the students are those that either I have mentioned as part of the lecture or is present in the slide that I have presented. Okay? So, let's go now to the diagnostic algorithm for a patient with suspected PTE. So what we do first is we assess the clinical likelihood or the so-called pretest probability for both pulmonary embolism and deep venous thrombosis. Let's start with pulmonary embolism. Using the Wells score, if the Wells score is more than 4, then it says that the pretest probability is high. So by all means, we should proceed with confirmatory imaging test, okay? So, which is the CTPA. On the other hand, if the Wells score is less than 4, then the pretest probability is not high. So that's where we now use the D-dimer, okay? If the D-dimer is normal, then our conclusion should be that there is no pulmonary embolism and no further intervention along that line is indicated. On the other hand, if the D-dimer is high, then it supports that there might be pulmonary embolism. So again, we resort to imaging tests, no? CTPA. Okay? For DVT, using again the Wells score, okay, we determine whether the likelihood is low or not low. Okay? If the likelihood is not low, then we go and proceed right away with leg ultrasonography. Okay? If it is low, then we look at the D-dimer again. If the D-dimer is normal, then there is no DVT. If it is high, then we should proceed again with imaging. Note here, and I think it's important to note, that the threshold for proceeding with the confirmatory imaging is lower for DVT than for pulmonary embolism. Meaning to say there's a higher threshold by which we say that there's a need for CTPA. Because compared, of course, to venous ultrasound, CTPA is not only more expensive, but it's also associated with more adverse reactions compared to just the leg ultrasound. That's why the threshold for proceeding with leg ultrasound is logically lower than for CTPA. Okay. Sometimes though, the principal imaging does not yield the necessary result, no? So we may need to do alternative diagnostics exams as shown here for DVT. For PE, really sometimes the issue is that the CTPA cannot be done, no? Whether it is available or currently unsafe to do at that particular time. Okay? So that the alternative here is that if we cannot do CTPA to diagnose PE, we'll just look at the venous ultrasound, no? As a surrogate marker for pulmonary embolism, no? Surrogate result, okay? Surrogate indicator, I mean, for pulmonary embolism. Okay. So this is also reflected in that algorithm presented in Harrison. Okay. So the alternative diagnostic test. So as I mentioned, in so far as the presentation is concerned, mainly it depends on the size of the embolus. Okay. So if there is if the embolus or the emboli are widespread, okay, So as I said, they tend to be multiple, okay? So if the thromboembolism is widespread, then it will be considered a high risk, no, for uh, adverse outcome. Okay, and patients with massive or high risk pulmonary embolism will present with dyspnea, syncope, hypotension, and cyanosis, and also may present as cardiogenic shock. Okay, so death is more likely compared to the other strata of pulmonary embolism, and it results from multi-organ failure. Okay. On the other hand, submassive or intermediate risk pulmonary embolism presents with normal systemic blood pressure, but there is clinical evidence of RV dysfunction, no? Like by 2D echo. Also, the cardiac biomarkers tend to be higher here in submassive or intermediate risk pulmonary embolism compared to low risk PE. Okay, so on the other hand, majority and good for our patients, majority of patients with PE are considered low risk. These patients are normotensive and there's no evidence of RV strain on 2D echo. So the prognosis is excellent with proper management. Okay. So what is now the correct management for VTE? Okay. It depends for DVT, it depends on the extent of the venous thrombosis. If extensive, then these patients need what's a so-called primary therapy. And this is in the form of a catheter-directed low-dose thrombolysis of the blood clot in the leg. Okay. For secondary therapy, meaning to say if the blood clot in the leg is not extensive, then instead of proceeding with the primary therapy, which is invasive, you can just give this patient systemic anticoagulation. Or if this is or if anticoagulation is contraindicated, you may use IVC filter. For pulmonary embolism, primary therapy is given for those who have high risk or massive PE. For patients with submassive PE, even those with intermediate risk, the role of primary therapy is controversial. When we talk about primary therapy, we refer to thrombolytic therapy or fibrinolytic therapy. Or this may be in the form of a pharmacomechanical therapy, catheter-directed, okay? Or this may be a surgical procedure, the so-called embolectomy, okay? Secondary therapy is really just letting the current PEB, okay, and just prevent more embolus from coming. Okay, and this is achieved again via anticoagulation principally, or inserting an IVC filter if anticoagulation is contraindicated. So this is how we manage pulmonary embolism. Okay, in terms of treatment, first we stratify the risk. If the patient is at low risk, then we do not institute primary therapy. We just institute secondary therapy. If the patient is high risk, then primary therapy is indicated. Okay, and this may be via thrombolysis or via catheter-directed therapy or embolectomy. For patients with falling under the intermediate risk, then this has to be individualized, no? So anticoagulation is the foundation or the mainstay in the management of DVT and pulmonary embolism. They do not, no? Anticoagulants do not directly dissolve the clot. They let the body lyse the clot which the body does eventually. Okay. What it does is to prevent further or recurrent embolism or venous thrombosis. The three main strategies are a parenteral therapy, bridge to warfarin, which is the classical or the oldest strategy that's still being used occasionally nowadays. Or parent therapy, then switching to NOAC. Okay. And then the latest form of strategy will be the use of NOAC, which is a novel oral anticoagulant monotherapy alone. Okay, so first via a loading dose and then followed by maintenance dose. So looking at the parenteral agents, the choices would be the infractionated heparin, which is the oldest maybe here, okay? Certainly older than the low molecular weight heparin, which offers certain advantages no, compared to just the older unfractionated heparin. And also, the other parenteral would be Fondoparinux. And one feature of this is that it does not cause heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So it may be used in patients who have what we call as the HIT, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. The other oral anticoagulants, the old ones, are the warfarin. Okay, and you do not really initiate warfarin alone, okay, in pulmonary embolism because it may induce a paradoxical exacerbation of hypercoagulability. No? So it may make the situation work. No? So when it is thus used as the oral anticoagulant, then you have to have an overlap with a parenteral anticoagulant for at least 5 days. No? NOAC, on the other hand, also known as direct oral anticoagulant, no? Is administered in a fixed dose. It has many advantageous features, no? Including no requirement for coagulation monitoring, few drug-drug and drug-food interactions. And listed are some of the NOACs available. So occasionally, you might encounter the major side effect of anticoagulation, which is hemorrhage. And depending on the degree of hemorrhage, there might be a need for reversal agents. On the other hand, if the hemorrhage is just minor, then you simply can stop the anticoagulant, okay, and let the complications subside. Okay. Okay. So now Harrison has adopted the European Society guidelines for pulmonary thromboembolism. Okay. So the issue is how long do we keep the patient on anticoagulation? Okay. So it will now depend on whether there are identifiable risk factor present, okay, whether the risk factor is temporary or not, and whether the risk factor is a major risk factor or not, okay. If you're just dealing with a major temporary risk factor such as surgery or a hip fracture, and there are no other identifiable risk factors, then these patients will just need a short course of anticoagulation, defined as usually 3 months. Okay. On the other hand, if there is no identified major risk factor or a risk factor that is persistent or indefinite, then anticoagulation is or has to be extended and may even be given indefinitely. Okay. So this is now the recommendation from the European Society of Cardiology 2019, which is also now adopted in Harrison. Okay. So I mentioned that there are certain patients who need secondary therapy for DVT or PE, but who are at risk of complications for anticoagulation or who have contraindications to anticoagulation. So this is now where interior vena cava filters come in. Okay. But they have their own set of complications, including the development of collateral channels, which causes pulmonary embolism to still occur despite uh, their application, no, the application of the IVC filter. And mind you, this filter might itself be a nidus for clot formation, no, and induce, okay, the post-thrombotic state in the leg. Now, looking at the management for massive PE, which we said will be in the form of primary therapy, we also need to give this patient the necessary volume repletion to maintain the cardiac output, no, while not aggravating, okay, the right ventricular wall stress. So we might need some vasopressors here, okay? But the important thing really is to get rid of the emboli that is causing the hypotension. Fibrinolytic therapy, okay, results in reversal of the right heart failure, no? And this is usually achieved by continuous infusion of TPA, no, tissue plasminogen activator. Again, the issue really is bleeding, and there is an increased risk of intracranial hemorrhage using this primary therapy. Okay. So if you're confronted with massive pulmonary embolism, then by all means, you provide this, no? Or if you are afraid of the intracranial bleeding, then you may need, if the resources are available, to resort to the catheter-directed therapy. These are the contraindications to fibrinolytic therapy, okay, and makes you resort to CDI, no, or CDT, catheter-directed therapy. So there are really three types here of catheter-directed therapy. One is purely pharmacologic only. So this entails, okay, threading a catheter towards the site or sites of embolism, and then administer continuous infusion of TPA. The dose of the TPA here will be, of course, smaller than systemically and peripherally administered TPA. Okay. The second type of catheter-directed therapy is mechanical only, whereby you try to crush and suction or snare the thrombus. Okay. Or it may be a combination of mechanical and TPA. Okay, so you combine the physical fragmentation of the thrombus with low-dose thrombolysis. Because of the risk of intracranial hemorrhage, okay, there is also a role for surgical embolectomy. So, as I have mentioned, then because pulmonary embolism may present as high risk with massive and embolism and hypotension, then prevention is going to be very important because there might not be time for the doctors, okay, to counteract the massive pulmonary embolism. So prevention is paramount, and what we often use would be the low dose molecular low dose are molecular heparin, okay, And also we can use the other oral agents, no? So low molecular weight heparin. Okay. So sometimes though, if we cannot give this patient anticoagulation, then we can alternatively use intermittent pneumatic compression devices in the legs. Okay. So to prevent pulmonary embolism. These are some of the forms by which we can prevent methods of preventing pulmonary embolism. So in summary, presented here, okay, you can just read through that so that I can proceed with the second lecture. Any questions for the first lecture? Haba, ang tawag doon, I think I will become tired after these 3 lectures. I'm looking at the chat box to see if there are wala, okay. So I'll go to the I'll go to any questions because I'm still sharing my slide here. So magsalita na lang. Let's now go to pulmonary hypertension. By the way, in the 22nd edition of Harrison, compared to the 21st edition, they really made a significant alterations in the chapter in pulmonary embolism and pulmonary hypertension, but not much updates on restrictive lung diseases, no? So wala akong masyadong bago na i-present dun sa restrictive lung diseases. Pero dito sa pulmonary hypertension meron na, no? Where is this? This is not it. Okay, so I think this can you see this slide? I need an answer verbally.
Pulmonary embolism pa
Ang
rin.
nakikita nyo?
Opo.
Hindi ito, pulmonary hypertension. Wait. Okay, sige. I'll do that. So, stop share. Okay. There are, wait, I'll just look at the chat, no? Okay, sige. So, we'll go to, I'll now share this one and then go through pulmonary hypertension. Picture is pulmonary hypertension. Can you see my slide?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay, good. So again, it says here that my internet is unstable. Sorry for that. But you're with me still, right? Okay. So these are the learning objectives which are similar for the past years. Okay. So the US has accepted now the European standard for diagnosing pulmonary hypertension, which is a mean pulmonary artery pressure of greater than 20 millimeters mercury, no? Because it used to be 25 before. No? So when you say pulmonary hypertension, we're not talking about just one disease, but rather a spectrum of diseases, no, involving the pulmonary vasculature. Okay, and hemodynamically, we can classify pulmonary hypertension into pre-capillary, post-capillary, and combined pre- and post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. By looking at the pulmonary artery wedge pressure and the pulmonary vascular resistance. Okay. So it has to be done during the process of right heart catheterization. Just like in pulmonary embolism, the symptoms of pulmonary hypertension are non-specific, which is why it tends to be underdiagnosed. No? The most common symptom will be dyspnea, no? In exertion or fatigability. And down the line. No? But as you can see, this is a very non-specific symptom. And often the dyspnea is attributed to underlying heart or lung disease. No? Kasi pulmonary hypertension may itself be a sequela or complication of a chronic heart or lung disease. So that sometimes akala nila yung pa rin. It's still the known cardiopulmonary disease that is causing the dyspnea. They just attributed it to a deterioration in the underlying condition, when in fact there is now the presence or the development of pulmonary hypertension. So the signs, on the other hand, the physical findings of pulmonary hypertension may result from the effect of the pulmonary hypertension on the vasculature. So that if you examine the chest, what you can see would be like, say, a accentuated P2, okay, a third heart sound in the right or left parasternal, okay, or you can hear tricuspid or pulmonic regurgitation murmurs. Or it may be signs due to backward failure from the right side of the heart. So you can see, maybe you can look at the jugular venous veins and find them to be distended. Okay, there might be abdominal distension, ascites, as well as hepatomegaly. You can also maybe observe signs of right ventricular forward failure, no? Such as pallor, dizziness, and peripheral cyanosis. Okay. On the other hand, what you might see in your examination will be signs pointing to the underlying cause of the pulmonary hypertension. No? So you may see the lungs, for instance, to be full of crackles and wheezing, signifying the presence of interstitial or obstructive lung diseases. Or you can find other abnormalities on the left side, or signifying left-sided heart disease. Okay? So this is an ECG finding that may be the presentation of pulmonary hypertension, no? Or a finding that might make you now suspect the presence of pulmonary hypertension. And as this ECG strip will show, and I got this from Harrison, the findings would include in this situation, there is right axis deviation there, no? And you can see in the V1 that there is a predominant positive deflection of the QRS complex, no? The R is quite predominant, okay? So whereas in normal, it should be a negative deflection. So these are ECG findings that suggest that there might be right ventricular hypertrophy present as a result of pulmonary hypertension. The second arrow there pointing to the depressed and inverted T waves, depressed ST and inverted T waves in lead V3, no? Is compatible with an RV, right ventricular strain. The most important initial screening test, no, if you're suspecting pulmonary hypertension, is the 2D echo, no? And in fact, sometimes what happens is that it becomes even the reason for suspecting. Like you might be doing a 2D echo because you're considering a left heart disease, and all of a sudden you find, uy, may problemang iba, no? That suggests the presence of pulmonary hypertension. Okay? And what are the findings onto the echo that will point to a possible pulmonary hypertension? This is the presence of hypertrophied and dilated right ventricle. The 2D echo is also capable of providing an estimate of the pulmonary artery systolic pressure. But this is just really a very rough estimate, no? So that if the estimate is 35 and above, then that bolsters the suspicion of pulmonary hypertension, no? And mind you, di ba, we defined a while back in the previous slide, pulmonary hypertension to have a mean pulmonary artery pressure of greater than 20, no? The other thing you can find into the echo will be other cardiac findings that can point to the underlying cause of the pulmonary hypertension. Okay. On the other hand, if the 2D echo shows normal results, then there's no need for further testing for pulmonary hypertension. Okay. In patients with reasonable functional capacity, another screening test would be the cardiopulmonary exercise test. And it will show certain findings pointing to the heart as the origin of, like, say, a patient's dyspnea or other symptoms. Okay. On chest X-ray, what you will find, okay, are enlarged central pulmonary arteries with vascular pruning. Okay, so the prune tree appearance, so-called, no? So this will give you a picture of really engorged central arteries. But after that, then the branches rapidly taper off. And you can also see signs of RV cardiomegaly. Okay. So, and the best way to show cardiomegaly is via a lateral chest X-ray, whereby you see that the right ventricle will encroach on the retrosternal free space. The chest CT scan will also give you in greater detail the findings that you may see on chest X-ray, but it is able to better demonstrate other findings in the lungs, no? Which may be the underlying cause of the pulmonary hypertension. And if you are and if you want to rule out acute pulmonary embolism, then you can use contrast. Okay. For CTEP, the primary screening test is VQ mismatch rather than CT scan. No? But I think there will be a change later on because to eventually prove the presence of CTEP, you will still need to do what we call as the digital subtraction CT angiography, no? Which is a higher form there to see or to confirm the presence of CTEP. Okay, so laboratory findings in pulmonary hypertension, you can see maybe signs of PH or signs of LV disease or signs of lung disease. Okay, and for signs of PH, you look again at RV enlargement, PA enlargement, pruning, etc. For left heart disease, you can see on X-ray, okay, the presence of curly B lines, okay, maybe pleural effusion, vascular congestion, left atrial enlargement, which may manifest as splayed carina, okay, and for signs of lung diseases, the following mentioned in this slide. So, the DLCO is reduced in patients with pulmonary hypertension. Okay, and if you do complete pulmonary function test, but all you find is just a reduction in DLCO, the others are normal, then this is the classical finding for what we for the so-called pulmonary arterial hypertension, which is a group of diseases under the umbrella of pulmonary hypertension. Okay. So spirometry and lung volume studies, okay, will also help you look for under or demonstrate underlying obstructive or restrictive lung diseases. Okay. The 6-minute walk test is an important test to gauge exercise limitation. Patients with pulmonary hypertension are often have nocturnal hypoxemia, which may be shown or demonstrated via nocturnal oximetry screening. The gold standard for diagnosing pulmonary hypertension is still the right heart catheterization with hemodynamic monitoring. And you can do also vasodilator tests here to help in deciding appropriate treatment. And later on in the slides that I will be showing you, I'll show you the algorithm on how to treat pulmonary hypertension using right heart catheterization and vasodilator testing. This is particularly done for patients who have pulmonary arterial hypertension. Okay. So in the previous slide, I showed you the hemodynamic classification. Okay. Now looking at the PVR and wedge pressure, as I said, you can classify the pulmonary hypertension into pre-capillary, which includes the following clinical groups, okay, or an isolated post-capillary, which is exclusively due to left heart disease, and a combined pre- and post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, which are also seen in diseases associated with pre-capillary, with the exception of PAH. What am I saying again? So PAH, purely pre-capillary. Sa other clinical groups present, shown in the pre-capillary, they may also present as combined pre- and post-capillary. Pero just to emphasize, if you have PAH, it is purely a pre-capillary pulmonary hypertension. Okay. So there's now an update on the classification. Not really much different, but the wording or the terminology that they use under the heading is a little different. No? Like say for group 4 here, it is pulmonary hypertension associated with pulmonary artery obstructions na. Hindi na siya PH due to CTEP, no? Which is what was written in older iterations of this classification. So pulmonary arterial hypertension or pulmonary hypertension group 1 or class 1 is a relatively rare form of pulmonary hypertension. Characteristic symptoms are dyspnea, chest pain, and syncope. Mortality is high because they are often diagnosed late in the course, no? And there is no really definitive treatment. Although there are now new drugs coming out that have not only shown promise but are really approved now for improving the hemodynamics and the functional capacity of the patient. Okay? The cause of death is right heart failure, okay? And so on and so forth. So the one on the left shows you the different disease entities falling under the umbrella of pulmonary arterial hypertension. No? So looking individually at the diseases, okay. So they may include the idiopathic and the heritable pulmonary arterial hypertension. I'll just breeze through that. Also under the umbrella of pulmonary arterial hypertension is the so-called portopulmonary hypertension, seen mostly due to liver cirrhosis, but may also be due to other causes of portal hypertension that is outside of the liver. Okay. Schistosomiasis may also be one of the diseases under the PAH classification or entity. And this one is, we know, to be quite common in certain areas in the Philippines. Okay, I presented this slide also in the years past. I think the important concepts here are the abnormalities present in the pulmonary arterioles, including fibrosis, muscular hypertrophy, thrombosis, and inflammation. The result is that it will increase the vascular resistance in the pulmonary arteries, okay, and lead eventually into a reduction in the cardiac output. Okay. So what causes really, what's the underlying mechanism? Several and many, including derangements in the genes, no? And some other findings include abnormalities in certain pathways that regulate the function of pulmonary vascular endothelium and smooth muscles. Okay, so particularly they found, for instance, in certain subsets that the endothelin 1 activity is elevated. And this endothelin 1 is an important vasoconstrictor, and it also causes smooth muscle hypertrophy of the vasculature. Okay. They also found in some subsets that the nitric oxide is low, and the nitric oxide is an important, this time, vasodilator with anti-proliferative pathways. Okay. So they also found certain prostaglandin levels to be depressed with concomitant increase in the thromboxane A2 production. Again, this results in vasoconstriction, in a net vasoconstriction, together with platelet activation and aggregation. Okay. Lately, they've found also, and this is exciting to certain clinicians, particularly those who are often handling pulmonary hypertension. They have found that pulmonary hypertension is, particularly the heritable pulmonary hypertension, is associated with a dysregulation of the BMP receptor. Okay, so that if there is a reduced activity of this BMP, this may cause increased activity of the counteracting pathway. So much so that still the net effect would be that there will be a tendency towards vasoconstriction and also towards the increased pulmonary vascular resistance. Okay. So this, I think, slide holds true even now, although they have identified additional pathways by which pulmonary arterial hypertension develops. No, so we can see from the previous and even from the succeeding slides that the underlying pathophysiology of pulmonary arterial hypertension has to do with a decrease in the activity of factors that should prevent the development of hypertension, and overactivity or preponderance of factors that promote vasoconstriction, muscle proliferation, inflammation, and platelet aggregation. No? So, how pulmonary arterial hypertension is presently being managed pharmacologically rests on the previous concepts of pathogenesis that I have mentioned to you. Okay, so that since we know that the endothelin receptor is an important pathway for vasoconstriction, etc., then there are pharmacologic agents that can antagonize or block the endothelin receptors, including bosentan, macitentan, and abrisentan. Okay. On the other hand, we see in the previous slides that nitric oxide is an important pathway for vasodilation. So we want to enhance this pathway. The thing though is that cyclic GMP, which is the mediator for vascular smooth muscle relaxation in the nitric oxide pathway, can be metabolized by the phosphodiesterase 5 enzyme. So we need inhibitors of this enzyme to enhance the activity or to extend the activity of the cyclic GMP. Okay, and these are the agents that will not only enhance the activity of the CGMP, but also stimulate further production of that. Okay. So prostanoids, we see in the pathophysio that they also are reduced in some patients with PAH. So we can administer exogenous prostanoids here, no? And these are some of the agents available. Okay. So what we can see now is that whereas before, there are just 3 pathways that are being addressed pharmacologically: the endothelin, the nitric oxide pathway, and the prostaglandin pathway. Now there is a 4th pathway which is being explored for treatment purposes, and this is the BRMP pathway. Okay. So that looking now at the algorithm for management of pulmonary arterial hypertension. First, this will depend on whether there is vasoreactivity as shown in right heart catheterization, and whether there are other risk factors that may be present, no, in this patient. So for patients who have been shown by RHC, right heart catheterization, to have vasoreactive vasculature, okay, then without the risk factors mentioned here, then the initial therapy would be an oral calcium channel antagonist. Whereas those patients who do not exhibit vasoreactivity will depend on whether the risk factors are present or not also. For non-vasoreactive, and this is the one on the extreme right, for non-vasoreactive subsets without risk factors, then the initial therapy is a combination of the endothelin receptor antagonist together with the PD5 inhibitor. So yun ang initial therapy. For patients with who are non-vasoreactive, this one is the one in the middle, with risk factors, okay, then the initial therapy is a triple therapy. So you have the endothelin receptor antagonist, the PD5 inhibitor, and supplementation with exogenous prostanoids. Okay. So group 2, pulmonary hypertension is pulmonary hypertension associated with left heart disease. Okay. The hallmark here is that the LA pressure is elevated. So that, remember, in the right heart catheterization, they look at the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, which is elevated more than 15 to signify post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. Ito yun, no? Because the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is also reflective of the left atrial pressure. Kaya mataas yun, no? So it's the elevated LA pressure results in venous hypertension, increase in the pulmonary artery wedge or pulmonary artery occlusion pressure. Okay. In patients with left heart disease who develop pulmonary hypertension, then this portends a poor prognosis. The treatment really is the treatment for the underlying heart disease here. No? So next, how about for patients, group 3, patients with lung disease or hypoxia? This is the second most common cause of pulmonary hypertension, second only to group 2. Okay. The rise in pulmonary pressure here is usually just modest, no? Hindi talaga tumataas. Ang pinakamatataas na artery pressures are seen in group 1 and group 4, no? The ones associated with pulmonary arterial hypertension and CTEP, no? So group 3 includes PH due to COPD, interstitial lung disease, etc. Okay. They are also seen in patients with sleep apnea. Okay. And we find that these patients are also generally chronically hypoxemic. And we know that chronic hypoxemia induces pulmonary vasoconstriction and pulmonary vascular remodeling. So the treatment here is geared towards the underlying lung disease. Okay. Now, group 4 is chronic is pulmonary hypertension associated with pulmonary artery obstructions. So under this umbrella, we have the CTEP and other pulmonary arterial obstructions, which are really quite rare. No? So the incidence of CTEP is low after a single PE. But if you have recurrent embolism, even if they are not manifested, okay, so asymptomatic, this may still lead to chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. Okay, the risk factors for the development are unclear. Okay, but of course has to do with recurrent pulmonary embolism. No? Management. Okay, for anticoagulation here, the anticoagulation is going to be indefinite, no, or lifelong, unlike the anticoagulation for acute pulmonary embolism. Okay, the definitive treatment here is pulmonary thromboendarterectomy, and in fact, if we are able to do this procedure and are successful, then this may lead to a cure, no, for the pulmonary for the CTEP. Okay. However, not all patients are candidates, no, for pulmonary thromboendarterectomy. So that the alternative here is just really the balloon angioplasty of the pulmonary arterial webs, no. So mechanical, again, catheter directed mechanical destruction or disintegration of the problems or occluding the pulmonary vasculature. Okay. And this patient may also be helped by pulmonary vasodilator therapy, the ones given for pulmonary arterial hypertension. So group 5 is pulmonary hypertension due to unclear or multifactorial mechanisms, and we have these different diseases falling under this group 5. I'll not go into that. No? Hindi ko bibigay sa exam. So that is okay. We know repeatedly that the symptoms of pulmonary hypertension is non-specific, insidious. It is underdiagnosed because it is often attributed to the other more common and easily recognized disease. The presenting feature, sorry, my internet is again unstable. The important, most important initial screening is the 2D echocardiogram. The presentation I mentioned may be a chronic dyspnea, okay, or it may just be an incidental finding on X-ray or echocardiography. The gold standard is by right heart catheterization with hemodynamic monitoring. Okay. The treatment is directed towards the underlying cause. The developments has in pharmacologic therapy has more to do with the treatment for pulmonary arterial hypertension. They're putting lots of resources there because, as I mentioned in my previous slide, the mortality is high. Okay, that's it. So I'm going now back to Zoom. I'm going to stop share first. And it's 9:24 now. There is one more lecture, and this is the restrictive lung diseases. Medyo mahaba yun. I think I will have to breeze through that lecture for us to finish before 10. So again, I might not talk a lot about what is written in the slides, but you do have the benefit of the old lecture transcriptions with you, and you can just fill in the contents there. No? I will now share my slides again for these restrictive lung diseases. And I think I need again a vocal response as to whether you are seeing my slide. Are you? Okay, good. So these are the learning objectives similar to years past. The outline will be talking about general features and then talk about intrinsic and extrinsic lung diseases. Okay. So this is a vast group of parenchymal, pleural, chest wall conditions. No, they share the same hallmark, which is a decrease in the TLC. Okay, the FAV1 and FBC are likewise low, but the ratio is generally normal. Although there are certain conditions that are associated also with a combined obstructive restrictive physiology. Okay. So categories, important to again differentiate between intrinsic and intrinsic. These are some of the diseases or umbrella of diseases under these bigger subsets. Okay, looking at the pulmonary function test, you can right off see that they all share a reduction in the TLC. Okay. The thing that differentiates intrinsic from extrinsic is the DLCO. So if the DLCO is reduced, then automatically that tells you that you're dealing with an intraparenchymal or a intrinsic lung pathology. Okay, whereas for extrinsic pathologies, the DLCO is normal. So how do you now differentiate the neuromuscular band from the pleural? Well, it's quite easy actually clinically, kasi sometimes the problem is easily seen by just physical examination and chest X-ray. Okay, but in terms of lung function, if you have neuromuscular, then particularly for those conditions that affect the extrinsic, the muscles of expiration, okay, then this will cause a weakening of the forceful expiration during pulmonary function testing, leading to increased RV. So what differentiates neuromuscular from pleural and chest wall will be the RV. Okay, so did you get that? So DLCO for intrinsic, increased RV for neuromuscular, normal RV for pleural. Okay. So interstitial lung diseases, many specific or clinical entities under that. And they may be classified into those with unknown causes as well as those with known causes. Although there are really many overlaps, as I mentioned in my previous lecture. For instance, RBILD, which is shown on the left side, is known to be associated with cigarette smoking, for instance. No? So clinical presentation, ILD, the most common presentation is chronic progressive dyspnea and a persistent dry cough. Okay. On the other hand, those ILDs associated with connective tissue diseases, the clinical presentation may be that of the connective tissue disease. Okay. Sometimes the presentation is incidental, shown on PFT or chest imaging na nakita, there's a seemingly restrictive physiology here on PFT or chest imaging showing interstitial densities. So the most common radiographic finding is a reticular finding. Okay, honeycombing is a finding that signifies advanced stage of the disease and portends poor prognosis. So CT scan finding depends on the underlying clinical entity, and this table shows you the common presentations on CT for the different entities. No? So medyo may importansya tong table na ito. PFT, we say for intrinsic lung disease, for interstitial lung disease, the TLC is reduced. Okay. DLCO is also reduced except for pulmonary hemorrhage like that. No? The FEV1 to FVC ratio is most often normal unless you're dealing with certain conditions, interstitial lung diseases that have concomitant obstructive physiology such as silicosis, hypersensitivity, pneumonitis, and sarcoidosis. So, the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or IPF may be the quintessential ILD. Okay, it is a chronic progressive fibrosing interstitial pneumonia of unknown cause. Okay, primarily seen in the older age groups. Okay, it has minimal systemic manifestations. Okay, if you look at the CT pattern here, and also if you do tissue biopsy, what you will find are the features of the so-called usual interstitial pneumonia. And when we talk about usual interstitial pneumonia, there are really three basic components there. No? One is traction bronchiectasis, one is honeycombing, and one is the reticular peripheral, and mostly basal fibrosis. Okay? So IPF, introduced onset, as I mentioned, it may occasionally develop exacerbations. You can find here basal crackles in most patients. Digital clubbing may be developed in some. And if you have pulmonary hypertension, which happens in 20 to 40%, you will have a loud P2. Imaging. So as I said, particularly for CT scan, the imaging findings will be that of the usual interstitial fibrosis. And when you do find that finding, then there is really no need for doing pathologic test or biopsy, because you can make already the diagnosis there, provided you have ruled out the other causes of UIP, no? Usual interstitial pneumonia. So like asbestosis, radiation fibrosis, like that, and chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So by history, pwede mo naman silang ma-rule out. And so by history, together with the CT scan findings, you can make a diagnosis of IPF. No? So this is the requirement there for the diagnosis. Okay, high resolution showing UIP. Okay, exclusion of known patterns, known causes of UIP. So IPF is often associated with comorbidities. So you treat those comorbidities. Quit smoking, oxygen therapy for some. Starting 2004, there have been 2 drugs that have received approval, 2014. And this I have excited some of those patients who have managed IPF, because they have found improvements in the functional capacity of these patients. Okay, so these are the tyrosine kinase inhibitor, nintedanib, and the antifibrotic agent pirfenidone. Okay. So pneumoconiosis is a subgroup of occupational lung diseases. This condition is caused by inhalation and deposition of mineral dust. Okay, and these are the specific clinical entities falling under the umbrella of pneumoconiosis. So one of them, as I mentioned the previous slide, is asbestosis. So this is pneumoconiosis caused by asbestos inhalation. Okay. So it is a diffuse interstitial fibrosing disease. Okay. So there is a gradual decline in the incidence of asbestosis because of enactment of laws which restricts the exposure to asbestos product. No? Asbestosis is just really one of the presentations or effects of asbestos exposure. No? So other asbestos-related pulmonary diseases include the ones mentioned here, no? Including here bronchogenic CA. No? So nakaka-lung CA siya, and also can cause pleural mesothelioma. On the other hand, it may just be associated with pleural plaque, no? So which may not even be associated with lung function impairment. So the presentation, a long latent period of exposure before asbestosis develops. Okay. So the presentation is also similar to other ILDs and also IPF, which is why history of exposure here is important. No? Radiology, again, the chest radiography is non-specific, It shares the same geologic findings as IPF and even chronic HP, etc. No? So, but the radiologic finding that is maybe unique to asbestosis compared to IPF and hypersensitivity pneumonitis and is the bilateral pleural thickening, no? As well as the pleural plaque. So kapag mayroong pleural involvement, not just the parenchymal, then this points more to asbestosis rather than the other causes of pulmonary interstitial fibrosis, no? So the diagnosis, so the history of exposure is going to be very important. Looking also you must find the characteristic findings on imaging, which I mentioned generally tend to be in the bases with reticulations there and fibrosis with involvement of the pleura. Okay. Treatment, well, supportive generally. Okay. Go now to silicosis. Silicosis is a fibronodular lung condition due to inhalation of dust-containing crystalline silica. Okay, so the occupations leading to or predisposing to silicosis are mentioned here. And what you can see is that because of the occupations are still being done at present, then the incidence or prevalence of silicosis is higher than that of asbestosis and other forms of pneumoconiosis, no? Yung coal workers also quite common because the mining for coal is still common practice or common occupation. Okay. The thing about silicosis is that not only does it produce the fibrosis in the lungs, it is also associated with there's also an immune component to silicosis. It causes macrophage dysfunction, which is why it may predispose to PTB, okay, and some other fungal infections. It is also associated with rheumatoid arthritis. Again, there's an immunologic component to silicosis, which explains that, no? The clinical presentation may depend on the degree of exposure. So if you're able to inhale large amount of dust, then you can develop acute silicosis. Okay, and these are the manifestations there, no? On the other hand, chronic silicosis is associated with chronic exposure to lower doses. These may present as simple chronic silicosis, which may be asymptomatic or just associated with mild dyspnea and cough. Or the chronic silicosis may be in the form of progressive disease. Okay, so with dyspnea, productive cough, weight loss, and also physical findings including cyanosis, clubbing, and cor pulmonale. So mas advanced, no? So chest radiography for acute silicosis, the radiographic feature is miliary, parang TB or parang pneumonia consolidation. Okay. For simple silicosis, the radiographic feature are multiple small nodules, mostly in the upper lung. And there might be the pattern of eggshell calcification of the hilar lymph nodes, which are quite characteristic but seen only in minority of cases. And I say characteristic, then it points to silicosis, but there are other conditions also that can give you eggshell calcification, no? Including sarcoidosis, for instance. CT scan may be unnecessary because the chest X-ray is able to demonstrate the characteristic nodules often, okay? Although, of course, the CT scan can show you in greater detail some of the calcifications and cavitations compared to just the plain X-ray. So the PFT will show the restrictive as well as the obstructive physiology. So diagnosis, again, history for occupational lung diseases. Importante talaga yung exposure history. Because although you may find characteristic findings on X-ray, like the eggshell calcification that I mentioned, and the fibronodular densities in the upper lobes, it is by no means pathognomonic for silicosis per se, because it may also be seen in other conditions, no? Even in coal workers pneumoconiosis, nakikita rin yan. Okay. So management is prevent further exposure, and then some of these other supportive treatment. Okay. Watch out for TB. For patients who have latent infection, then consider preventive treatment for that. No? So coal workers pneumoconiosis, I would tell you right off that this shares certain clinical characteristics or certain clinical features that are similar to silicosis. And in fact, sometimes really they even tend to coexist, particularly among minors. No? So still, Semirara in the Philippines is a big company which exports coal to other countries. No? So these are the presentations of coal dust exposure. Anthracosis is just really a symptomatic accumulation of coal dust without consequence. Or the presentation may be that of simple coal workers pneumoconiosis seen with prolonged exposure. Okay. Often not associated with pulmonary impairment, in contrast to complicated coal workers pneumoconiosis. The others are quite self-explanatory. Chronic beryllium disease, no? Or berylliosis. Wala na masyadong acute beryllium disease because of, again, legal measures that were adopted. So, parang high intensity exposure rarely develops or happens. But still, there is chronic exposure in certain industries to beryllium. And not all patients who get exposed develop the disease, because there is a component there of a cell-mediated immune response to the exposure. No? So if you're able to mount that, then you develop the chronic beryllium disease. No? The presentation is similar to that of sarcoidosis. The industries that are associated with chronic beryllium disease are mentioned here. Okay. The chest X-ray is similar to sarcoidosis, so upper lobe fibrosis, hilar adenopathies, more common in sarcoidosis than in beryllium disease. Okay. The picture on PFT is that of a combined restrictive obstructive also. Okay. Of course, the DLCO will be low because it is intraparenchymal. Okay. So the diagnosis requires not just history of exposure working in the mentioned industries, but also evidence of the immunologic response, no, to the beryllium. Hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Okay. This is an inflammatory response due to inhalation of a variety of antigens. No. Again, not you do not automatically develop the condition. There needs to be some sensitization for the condition to develop. Okay. The common antigens are listed here, as well as the common industries that are associated with HP. Again, depending on the degree of exposure, the presentation may be that of acute HP, and the presentation here is similar to that of pneumonia. No? But here, the condition resolves once you discontinue the exposure. Okay, so subacute HP happens after continued exposure. The symptoms are more gradual. So parang TB naman ito, no? There's still also going to be some cough, dyspnea there. Okay, maybe some fever. Okay, parang ang TB. Okay. On the other hand, chronic HP, the presentation is similar to that of IPF. Okay, so that again, to distinguish it from IPF, you have to delve deeper into the occupation and occupational exposure of the patient. So for acute HP, the chest X-ray is that of micronodular or ground glass densities. Okay, so a bit different from community-acquired pneumonia. For chronic HP, the radiologic feature is that of the UIP or usual interstitial pneumonia. Okay. The diagnosis for HP, not universally accepted criteria, but generally, you look at the combination of the exposure history, the signs and symptoms, the presence of the action to the antigens, as well as the imaging features. So the treatment is antigen avoidance and maybe oral steroid for subacute and chronic PPE. So now we look at the neuromuscular and chest wall diseases. Okay. These are diseases that affect the components of the respiratory pump. Neuromuscular diseases that affects the respiratory system includes myasthenia gravis, ALS, myopathies. So non-muscular chest wall diseases include obesity and kyphoscoliosis, ankylosing spondylitis, etc. In patients with neuromuscular diseases, a common cause of death is lung infection because they have impaired cough reflex and clearance mechanisms. Clinical presentation. Okay, so idiopathic kyphoscoliosis readily seen or assessed by physical examination or may be seen during chest radiography. Okay. Neuromuscular diseases, okay, may present with progressive dyspnea. Okay. So watch out for recurrent infections. So the lab findings depend on the specific clinical entity. If you're dealing with myositis, then expect the CK level to be elevated. Rib cage and spinal or vertebral abnormalities are readily assessed using radiography. Okay. Diaphragmatic dysfunction may be assessed using fluoroscopy or ultrasound because they will show you the movement of the diaphragm during a sniff maneuver. No? Well, during this maneuver, you expect the diaphragm to go down or to go caudally. Okay. But in patients with diaphragmatic paralysis or flaccid diaphragm, during the sniff maneuver, the affected diaphragm goes up towards the thorax. The LCO, again, just to emphasize, is normal because this is extrinsic. No? So nocturnal desaturation and sleep disorders are common in neuromuscular diseases. Management, then it is geared towards the underlying condition. And additionally, you help the patient clear the secretions in patients with neuromuscular diseases. You might need NIV for patients who have sleep disordered breathing. And to help clear the airways of secretions, you may need tracheostomy. No? So looking at the restrictive lung disease, we know or we have learned that they include a large group of diseases. No? So the common feature is a reduced total lung capacity, etc. Any questions? I'm going now to the Zoom. Okay, so let me see. Are you seeing? I'm now in Zoom, right? I'll stop share. Okay. Okay. So I'm glad to see that there's still 208 participants remaining. Although I'm not sure whether they were actively listening or not. No? But again, I'd like to emphasize that the questions will come from what I've mentioned or what is shown in the slides. Any questions from the group before we end this session? Wala. Wala. If none, then that's it. Hope you do well in the exams. Bye-bye.
Thank you po, Doc.
Okay.